Hello, it's Dr. Nicole Winbush with Sankofa Healing Arts, and I am here today to talk to you about a topic that is very uh, interesting to me and very important, and that is about glyphosate. Glyphosate, which is also goes by the name of Roundup. It's a weed killer, sometimes referred to as an herbicide, and there's a lot of potential health impacts that this chemical can have. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And importantly, what you and what we collectively might be able to do to shift our exposure. So I'm talking about this because the more I've read, the more increasingly I'm concerned about the substances in our environment that we're exposed to in general, and specifically glyphosate, just because, as we'll see, it's something that is just widely um, diffused in our environment, and it has a lot of potentially complex effects on our own health, on the ecosystem in general. And so I just feel like this is information that people need to know about, and perhaps you're coming to this talk because you do already know something about it. In which case, I definitely welcome your feedback and am always wanting to learn more. So my name is Dr. Nicole Winbush, and I have a practice called Sankofa Healing Arts and Functional Medicine. I am based in North Carolina, but also have the ability to work with folks in California and Minnesota and Georgia. So I can give you maybe a little bit more information about my practice at the end of this talk, but really I want to spend the time talking about what we're here to talk about, which is glyphosate. I would just say that this is an informational talk. There's nothing here that should be used as a substitute for medical advice. So first, I think it's always good to just check in with yourself and get clear about what your intention is. Why did you decide to spend a few minutes with me today learning or hearing about this? What are you hoping to get out of this talk? And hopefully those intentions will be met. And I, again, look forward to your feedback if they aren't, or if there's more information that you would have liked to have seen. So this is where we're going to be going. We're going to talk about glyphosate, what it is, how it works, what are some of these health concerns and the impact on the environment, and what can we do about it. So simply put, glyphosate is the most widely used weed killer in the world. And it's widely distributed, at least in this country, when they do testing, and this is, I think, a couple of years old at this point, it's found in the urine of more than 80% of American adults and children. And it's associated, as we'll see, with a wide range and a growing number of health concerns. So the specifics of these graphs are not so much important, but the use of glyphosate has increased tremendously over the past 20, 25 years. And you can see in the graphs here, the red line is the amount of what's called herbicide tolerant seed, or basically plant seeds that are tolerant of glyphosate. And so this has taken off. These are what are known as GMO seeds. And this technology for the GMO seeds, which we'll talk about exactly what that is in a moment, was developed, I believe, in kind of the mid to late 90s. And so their use skyrocketed. And since these seeds are able to tolerate being sprayed with glyphosate, a chemical that went from just being used more modestly at the beginning of the growing season to kind of eradicate weeds before a field was planted, just took off, with the application now being able to happen throughout the growing season. And there are certain crops that are the majority of the GMO seeds, which we'll talk about also in a moment. But just a digression here to clarify something. It's not uncommon that people who come down on the side of saying, there's probably not any problem with GMO seeds or glyphosate, will say, well, we've, as human beings who have engaged in agriculture for millennia, for thousands of years, have always been selecting out for the features that we want to have in the crops that we grow. And that is true. But the genetic modification process is very different than a selective breeding process. So, with genetic modification, you're actually going inside the cell, inside of the genetic material of the cell, and often inserting, taking out genetic material and replacing it with material, genetic material from often another entire species, right? That has some kind of characteristic that you want to then breed into this plant. Whereas selective breeding is more akin to the way that various types of dogs have been bred through the ages to produce, certain types of physical features amongst the dogs. It's the same uh, breed, or crossing different species of apples, right? These are the same species that can sort of naturally reproduce with one another. So it's completely false to say that the process of creating GMO seed is akin to selective breeding. And this is a note that we'll just come back to, which is that the highest levels of glyphosate are actually often found in crops that are not genetically modified. And I guess I'm going to leave that as a little bit of teaser that we'll come back to tell you why exactly that is. So now we're continuing about this question of, well, what does glyphosate do? And so I want to not get into the weeds with this, keep it simple. So, glyphosate is this weed killer. It's a chemical compound that's applied to plants and also the soil around the plants, right, in a field, for instance, to keep other competitive weeds from growing and outgrowing the plants, right? So that chemical then is going to be potentially absorbed into the plant and make its way into the soil. Some of it may land directly on the soil. And what's important to know is that glyphosate has several potential actions. And these are actually things that glyphosate as a chemical has been patented for. So, in addition to just being a weed killer or an herbicide, glyphosate is also patented to be what's called an antimicrobial. It's like an antibiotic, it's able to kill bacteria. And it also has a patented effect of being able to bind up minerals. And so, when we look at the soil, and if you are not someone who's grown crops or intimately familiar with the soil, you may or may not know this. The soil is its own complex ecosystem. The soil has its own microbiome and its own structural integrity from root systems and from other microbial species and fungi that help to stabilize it. And there are also lots of minerals in the soil, and those minerals go to the roots of the plants and help provide plant nutrition. And so we begin to see that if we are applying chemicals to plants that then get absorbed into the soil, or applying directly to the soil, chemicals that can disrupt that environment, the microbial bacterial balance of that healthy bacteria that's in the soil microbiome, that can start to become problematic. If we have the glyphosate binding up the minerals that those plants need to be using for nutrition, that is also problematic. And the end result can be that the food itself is less nutritious. And I think this is probably why one of the common findings when they actually are assessing organic produce nutritional quality compared to non-organic is that the organic produce is often higher in vitamins and minerals, et cetera. So that's one thing. And then this figure too can be very busy, but the main thing is to say we talked about that the soil has a microbiome, has all of these beneficial bacteria that are working in concert to support the structure of the soil, the function of the soil, the plants that grow in the soil. We too, as human beings, have a microbiome composed of billions and billions of bacteria. And increasingly, we also realize of various fungal species and viruses that help support really a bunch of essential functions in our own bodies and do everything from help balance our immune system and support the absorption of certain nutrients and even help to produce certain neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin. And that this microbiome, we often think of it as just in the gut, but we have microbiomes in many places throughout our body. And so we'll come back to some of those themes. I also like to mention, for those of us who may have beloved pet companions, that a lot of these same harms and exposures that we're talking about for people are equal, if not more so, in our pets, because of their food supply, what they're exposed to through water, through groundwater, or exposure at nose level as they're sniffing around to sprayed vegetation. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about how glyphosate works uh, specifically. And so it works by disrupting this key plant nutrition pathway called the shikimate pathway, which there's no test on this, but I just think it's really fun to say, the shikimate pathway. And again, really wanting to keep this simple, but wanting to make sure that you kind of have an understanding of the full picture. This shikimate pathway is a pathway that is found in the cells of plants. It is also found in bacteria. It is not found in human cells, which was part of why, kind of, when glyphosate was originally discovered, this idea, oh, it's perfectly safe, because we don't have this pathway that's being disrupted by the glyphosate in our cells. But it is disrupted by, or it does disrupt this pathway in many of the bacteria that inhabit our microbiome. And we'll come back to that a little bit. In plants, the shikimate pathway is part of this cycle that, the inputs that come into plants, the sunlight, the CO2, the nutrients, this shikimate pathway is part of what helps to produce certain amino acids. And all I would have you remember is that amino acids are kind of like the building blocks of proteins, right? So they're almost like these little Legos that go on to build proteins. And what are proteins? Proteins are basically the things that do everything in us as human beings, in animals, in plants. Proteins are help provide structure. They are what make collagen and cellular receptors. Hormones are proteins. The immunoglobulins and other parts of our immune system are proteins. Proteins help transport hormones around in our blood. The way that we're able to move our muscles is dependent on proteins. So proteins do everything. And in plants, again, there's no test on any of this or on this picture, but what this is showing is that these important protein or amino acids that come out of that are disrupted by and not produced adequately when the shikimate pathway is disrupted are what go on to produce a lot of the antioxidants in plants. And antioxidants are the really helpful, prized chemical constituents that we think, really beef up the nutritional content, right, of fruits and vegetables, that provide them with their rich color, that help to prevent, cellular aging, and all of these things that we don't need to go into right now. But this shikimate pathway is what's disrupted. This shikimate pathway prevents the production of really key amino acids that go on to create plant antioxidants and to create many different proteins, including things like the serotonin, the neurotransmitters that we rely on our gut bacteria, to help us create adequately. So again, another somewhat busy slide that's just talking about and showing this web of interconnection, right? Us as humans, we eat various crops that we raise. The soil also supports various fungal species and other plants. There are livestock and pollinators and other non-livestock animals, and the biosphere and the water cycle. And these are all points where glyphosate can kind of get into and contaminate the system. And so what happens, or what do we think happens when it does? And so now we're going to be talking about what are some of the range of harmful health associations that have been observed in studies. And this is really just touching on some of this generally. This is not a full survey of the literature, but just touching on some themes. And before I get started, I want to note that in general, there is an accepted consensus that there are concerns around the safety of glyphosate. Now, how concerned or how many associations people are willing to make kind of varies across a spectrum. And these two citations here, the first, the facts and fallacies in the debate on glyphosate, sort of touches on this. And this was put together by a couple of researchers. It was an opinion piece, kind of calling out someone who's been a public intellectual and very much in this space about glyphosate safety concern, and that's Dr. Stephanie Seneff, who's an MIT associated researcher. And she put out a book last year, I believe, that goes into a lot of detail and makes a lot of associations for all of the ways that glyphosate may be impacting our health. But some people feel like she plays a little fast and loose with some of the data. And so all of that is to say that I'm going to kind of stick fairly to the midline. But, there are people like Dr. Seneff who have even a whole realm of even other concerns that I won't touch on as much today about the ways that glyphosate may be impacting our health. So some of the impacts that I'm going to talk about are, specific organ damage and organ disease, looking at the kidney and at the liver, hormonal disruptions, some signal and concern about genetic effects, and then cancer, which has been pretty widely in the news. So the first thing I want to say is that, there's different ways that we can look at this question of the safety of glyphosate. And like many things, it's really not ethical to do randomized trials where we would have human beings and be dosing them with various amounts of glyphosate, despite what Bayer or Dow Chemical, Bayer is the parent company that now makes glyphosate, despite them saying it's completely safe, that would never pass muster. And so what we're left with are other ways to try to figure out what's going on or what level of concern we need to have. And so this first note here, or this article, is what's called a consensus statement. And the little picture there of people holding hands is just for me to remind myself to tell you that a consensus statement is basically when a group of experts on a topic come together and survey all the literature, and from that survey make a determination about some of the major themes that the literature shows. And so this consensus statement, some of the things that they mention are that the persistence of glyphosate in our water and in the soil is likely much longer than has previously been said or documented, that it is very well dispersed into the global soybean supply, that the science that kind of underlied what was previously thought to be, determining what the tolerable sort of daily limits of intake were is probably flawed or outdated. And so that there really needs to be a reappraisal of its safety in many of those contexts. So those are some of the findings that they report. Another way that we can look at the evidence around safety is to look at populations of people and somehow assess what their likely exposure just in life is to the compounds of concern. And so that's also a type of study that's been done. And here there was a noticing that in kind of around 2010, 2012, later 2017, that in El Salvador, there was this elevation in chronic kidney disease that was being seen in a younger population of generally healthy people who did not have high blood pressure, who did not have diabetes or kind of any other cause that would usually be underlying cause that would usually lead to chronic kidney disease. And so kind of evaluating this population, the rates were also much higher in folks who were in agricultural professions and who had likely exposure to glyphosate. And so this is some of the data that's come out that's been very concerning, especially about kind of what's happening on a global scale as it relates to large agribusinesses and the human cost of this glyphosate exposure. And then the other option that we have are animal studies and animal models. And so there are a fair number of rat and mice studies. Here's one that showed that mice exposed to glyphosate definitely had increases in inflammatory markers and markers of insulin resistance, which is the condition that leads to type 2 diabetes. And then some other interesting findings about what would be transgenerational effects. So mother mice, I believe, yeah, these were mice that were exposed to glyphosate. And then their offspring actually were found to have higher rates of liver inflammation. And all of this is significant because we are also dealing with an epidemic now of what's known as non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So more and more people who are experiencing fat infiltration of the liver, which can lead to inflammation of the liver, which can actually lead to liver failure and the need for transplant. And not saying that glyphosate is the only contributor to this, but definitely some mechanisms and some signals that it may be part of what's able to explain this huge rise. And this is a very interesting study because a lot of the studies that are done sometimes are done at what would be called supraphysiologic doses that are far in excess, at least proportionally, as to what humans might be receiving on a daily basis. And sometimes these studies are done over a short period of time. But this is a study that really kind of mimics what is the type of exposure that many people might have, which is over the long term. This was a 2-year study done in rats, which is, getting close to kind of their full lifespan, at very low doses of like 0.1 part per billion in water, and finding that when you look at something that's called metabolomic research, which kind of almost lets you see in real time what's happening inside of the cells in terms of the biochemistry, that shifts were happening that were consistent again with increased levels of inflammation and potentially moving in, and fatty liver disease. And again, looking at a high-risk population, people who for a living have to apply pesticides, done through a longitudinal population study called the Agricultural Health Study, folks who are pesticide applicators, I guess that's right, including glyphosate as one of the pesticides, have higher rates of thyroid disease. So again, these are associations. They're not clearly establishing cause, but the important thing is that there are many signals of concern here from many different channels, both looking at populations, looking at exposure studies among animals, kind of combining all of the different literature and looking at the consensus guidelines to suggest that there are real signals for harm. And I didn't include it here, but it's a signal for harm that's significant enough that the World Health Organization has labeled glyphosate a likely carcinogen, and we'll talk about cancer briefly in a moment. But I also want to mention that this is an issue that disproportionately impacts communities of color, and that's for many reasons, a few of which are that the vast majority of agricultural and landscape workers are people of color, that there have been instances documented where communities of color are more likely to receive, maintenance of their park or to be sprayed with glyphosate. So this was one of these is from the picture is from a study that was done in New York, and the New York City parks, I think, has since discontinued the use of glyphosate in large part, but prior to them doing that, there was a study that showed that clearly there were much higher rates of application of glyphosate in communities of color. And there have been lawsuits brought by Black farmers uh, asserting that the economic pressure to up, or I should say, Black farmers are often under a lot of economic pressure or experiencing precarity that may compel them to use these harmful products. And the US Black farmers did sue Monsanto, or I may have been Bayer at that time. And there was a settlement, although the details of that settlement have not been made public. And finally, at least in this section, there are concerns about glyphosate and increased risk of cancer. And this is where, this is not my only area of interest. And so I cannot say that I have a full grasp of all the literature. There are some varying results and varying study methods, some of which suggest that there's an increased risk of blood cell cancers like lymphomas and associations with breast cancer. And this picture is of Dwayne Johnson, a California groundskeeper, who received an initial judgment of almost $290 million in a civil suit against Bayer that linked his glyphosate exposure to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And that ruling stood, but the amount of the award did decrease significantly, still in the tens of millions of dollars, I believe, when everything was said and done. And then I'm going to actually, in the interest of time, not go through these studies and get to the final part, which is what can we do about this? And so this is a reminder, all of the ways that we may be getting exposed through the water supply, through eating um, um, sea creatures, fish or sea vegetables, things like that, that are grown in the oceans that may have glyphosate pesticide residues, groundwater runoff into the water supply, eating food that's been sprayed with glyphosate, coming to us through the air and exposure. And, all of the other parts of our ecosystem that are impacted, whether it be bees, butterflies, other pollinators, other animal and plant exposures. So a couple of thoughts someone could potentially have, depending on where they're sitting or their perspective, is that maybe your resources are limited. And you might say, well, you're just going to tell me I need to buy everything organic, and food's expensive and I can't afford to eat everything organic. So what's the point? Conversely, somebody might say, that's fine. I do buy organic whenever I can. And so what do I need to worry about? And so where we want to talk is kind of in the middle place between those, that we can't buy ourselves out of an interconnected ecosystem, and that at every place there is something that we can do, and that it's not about individual responsibility, but finding a way to kind of make some of these choices more community-based and collaborative. So in terms of just big buckets, some of the things we can do are to identify and limit or eliminate high exposure foods, to support our own biology, like our liver, in the functions that it already does, which is to kind of get rid of toxins or get rid of things that we do not need inside of our bodies, to beef up or bolster our use of high impact foods that, again, will maybe help some of that physiology, like the liver functions and the excretion functions. And then to do our best to stretch food dollars by limiting waste, or getting access to free or subsidized produce. And so some of this may read like, oh, she's just giving me a list of all the things I still need to do by myself. But if you just bear with me for a couple more minutes, where I want to leave you is in a different place, which is how can we do some of these things together? So just in case people are not aware, there is the Environmental Working Group. Their website is ewg.org. And every year they determine what are the foods that are highest in pesticides, residues, and lowest. And I don't like their terminology of clean versus dirty foods, but the clean list is the list of foods that are lowest in pesticide residues. And again, this can have economic implications because 70% of these foods have no pesticide residue. And so these may be things that you opt to not spend your food dollars buying organic, and that can save some money. Similarly, the foods that are on the high list, usually lots of berries and the leafy greens, etc., are the ones that you really do want to prioritize if you can, getting organic versions of. And I have an informational sheet that you can get that will have some of this information summarized. This is where I come back to that point that just because something has a non-GMO label on it does not mean that it does not mean that it is pesticide free. Because glyphosate is also used not just to kill weeds, but to basically kill non-GMO plants at the end of the growing season to desiccate, or which is also known as dry them out so that they're easier to harvest. And this is often grains like wheat, rice, beans. So these foods, even if they have a non-GMO label, if it's a finished product that has those types of foods in them, may often be quite high in pesticide residue, even higher than some GMO foods. In the area of limiting food waste, finding creative ways to do that, creative and easeful ways, as I like to say, to do that. That could include, before everything rots in the bottom of your vegetable bin, throwing it in a stock pot and making some soup, or throwing it in a pressure cooker, finding an easy way to make broth, or maybe doing that with some other folks. We talked about that or touched on that there can be foods that support our own biology in terms of liver health, liver detoxification functions. And so some of those are listed here. These are often going to be your foods that are high in sulfur, things like garlics and onion, cruciferous vegetables, which is like the broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower family. Potentially making your own sprouts at home, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the next slide. And that, again, some of this information is included on the informational sheet if you want to sign up for that. So growing your own does not have to mean that you have a huge backyard garden or even a big container garden. It could be a pot with a couple of herbs that allows you to just get some really concentrated nutrition, like we find in some of those aromatic herbs like rosemary or like basil. Literally just sprinkling that or adding that to some of your food. It could be growing sprouts, which doesn't even require soil, or a pot. And there's some resources, again, in that informational sheet that I can provide you if you sign up for the list. And then there was a really interesting book that came out several years ago called Eating on the Wild Side by a woman named Jo Robinson, that talked about how the process of creating food for kind of commercial use has led a lot of times to the, foods being a lot sweeter, to be more palatable, and often losing some of their nutritional value. So what are some of the foods that you can buy in your grocery store, but are going to be sort of closer to the wilder, more nutritionally dense varieties, things like green onions, which are close to wild onions, green apples that, are a little bit more tart, dandelion greens, or some other greens that you might choose to mix in with other greens. And then water. Water is something that we need to talk about. I remember not that long ago, I said I would never, ever pay for water. And while I don't, drink bottled water, I definitely pay much more attention now to filtering water. And having an effective filter that can remove glyphosate does not require you to buy an expensive filtering system per se. There are some countertop filters that do a really good job. And again, I've kind of collected some of that information and can provide more detail for you in an informational sheet that I'll provide. So this is the point that I wanted to get to, which is, those are some of the ideas that I've come up with. But we know that it's so much easier to do things together, to do things collaboratively. And we also know that intention is really powerful. And so it's not a matter necessarily even of having to do all of those things, but having a clear intention to do one and to collaborate around that, to collaborate around how you can do it and how you can share the resources and the effort and the values around doing that. And so that's what I would invite people to think about, is how you might do that or how that might look. And while this is a recorded presentation, you could pause this right now and spend a moment reflecting on that. And I'll give you a moment to think about if you want to pause it and do that. And then these were some of the ideas that I came up with. What's one small thing that you might be able to do with others? Learning how to grow sprouts. There are so many tremendous benefits to sprouts and sprouting food, and specifically even sprouting broccoli sprouts, and the rich source of nutrition and compounds that help support kind of the liver and liver detoxification in those. And again, I have some resources for you about that. It could look like planting an herb container with some neighbors, right? Even if you're in an apartment building or something, just gathering some seed, planting that, and having it be something that people can come and grab a little cilantro or a little parsley off of, or a little basil when they need to garnish something at their dinner. And there is benefit to that concentrated richness of antioxidants and phytochemicals that we find in herbs. Buy water pitcher filters in bulk with friends, right? So some of the pitchers that have been found to eliminate glyphosate are not terribly expensive, but where they get you is the cost of the filters. But if you belong to a buying club, or if you order together online, you can often cut that price by a fraction, by a significant amount, if you collaborated with your neighbors to kind of get the same type of filter, and then buy, 4, 5, 10 filters together. Having a monthly potluck where you get together your vegetable scraps and make broth that everybody can take home. Or even the thought work of having your book club read a book like Farming While Black, or having a discussion on that book about what you might do together to further some of those ideas. So that's what I came up with. I hope that this was helpful or informative or inspiring in some way. I would love to continue the dialogue and conversation around this idea. And I welcome your thoughts and your comments. If you would like to sign up for my mailing list, I will send you an informational sheet that goes through some of the resources that I mentioned while I was giving the talk here. And that can be found at sankofahealingarts.com /list glyphosate. I also welcome you to follow me on Instagram at Sankofa Healing, and am wishing you all the best for your health and well-being.